Brothers and sisters, welcome. Father Frank Pavone here, National Director of Priests for Life. Thank you for joining our pro-life MAGA broadcast, Make America Great Again. You know I have one of these hats. I'm sure many of you do as well. Wear it proudly because making America great again is something that all of us as patriots always want to do. You know, I have a hat like this also, not with me right at the moment, but it says, make the courts great again. And that's the topic I want to talk with you about here today. A very important motivator for our midterm elections, and we'll explain why. Make the courts great again. Make the courts, once again, what they are supposed to be, what they were intended to be by our founding fathers, what they need to be in order to preserve fundamental rights, starting with the right to life. Make the courts great again by limiting them to their proper constitutional role, which is not to make laws, which is not to create policy, which is not to let judges impose their personal opinions and preferences on whatever cases they are deciding, but rather is to uphold justice, to be impartial, to apply the Constitution as it is written and as it was originally intended by those who wrote it, and to take the laws as they are written and originally intended to be, and that the text reveals them to say, and faithfully apply them. This is the role of the courts. And unfortunately, the courts are right now in America out of control, far transgressing the boundaries that the Constitution places upon them. You and I are familiar with this. We're going to delve into it just a little bit more here today in this pro-life MAGA broadcast. And we're going to remind you so that you can remind your friends and fellow citizens of how crucial an issue this is in the elections. Because, brothers and sisters, more than half of the people 2 years ago who voted in the 2016 elections said that the courts were a motivating factor in their vote. Of course, if I were to ask you what single event that was unforeseen, unanticipated prior to the 2016 election had the most impact on that election, a fair answer would be the death of Justice Scalia. Think about it. A lot of people were already strongly motivated by the fact that the Supreme Court is an issue in every national election because it is the president who is given by the Constitution the responsibility to nominate federal judges. He chooses a qualified man or woman and puts their name forward, and then the United States Senate is asked by the Constitution to give advice and consent. In other words, they need to examine the qualifications of the judge who is nominated, determine whether he or she is sufficiently qualified, and then vote to confirm that man or woman to the judicial seat for which they have been nominated. Now, this includes the Supreme Court. It also includes the other courts. We'll get to the court structure in just a moment. But the point I'm making here is that more than half of the voters in 2016 were motivated by the fact that who sits in the White House and who occupies the U.S. Senate determines what kind of people are going to be chosen for the court. So that was already a strong motivating factor. And because we knew that there would likely be within the term of the new president a vacancy on the Supreme Court. We always know that there are vacancies on the lower federal courts, and the president has to nominate those replacements too. But this motivation became even more forceful, even more concrete, when the idea of a Supreme Court vacancy was not just a prospect for the future, but a reality staring us in the face in the present. And that's what happened when Justice Scalia unexpectedly passed away. Now we were faced with the fact that, okay, there's a vacancy that needs to be filled. Who's going to fill it? Will it be a Republican president choosing judges according to the judicial philosophy that the Republican Party upholds, which is the one I just described, an impartial judge, not a policymaker? Or will it be filled by a Democrat president, and the Democrat Party believing in judicial activism, believing that it's not a matter of a fixed meaning in the Constitution, but rather something that can change all the time? This was a big, big question, a big motivator. Most of those who were motivated by the courts as an election issue, in fact, voted for President Trump. Now, what I'm hoping is that now in the midterm elections, we get those Trump voters out again, likewise motivated by the issue of the courts. Now, since President Trump took office, of course, we have had not one but two Supreme Court justices appointed, and that is one of the most long-lasting, consequential actions that a president can take and be remembered for, because they end up serving not for years, but for decades to come. But it's not just the Supreme Court that's at issue. You know, the Supreme Court only takes about 1% of the cases that are submitted to it, and it takes about between 60 and 80 cases a year. There are tens of thousands of cases submitted to the court. 60 to 80 cases. Where do all the rest of the federal cases get decided? Well, there are two levels of courts underneath the Supreme Court. You have the circuit courts of appeal. These appellate courts cover the nation geographically. There are 13 circuits. Now, you can see this on our some of the things I'm going to discuss here on our website, ProLifeVote.com. There are circuit courts of appeal. There are 13 of them. Let me just tell you what some of them, like where I live here in Florida, we're under the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, comprising the states of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. That's the 11th Circuit, those three states. Go a little west, and Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas are covered by the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals. Then a little north of that and further west, the 10th Circuit covers New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And on it goes. For across the United States, wherever you are, there is an appellate court that is the federal court dealing with federal cases arising in that region. And 99% of the time, that's the court that has the last word. Those cases don't get up to the Supreme Court. The president likewise nominates all the judges to fill those seats in all 13 circuit courts. And the Senate has to confirm them too. So in this election, as we elect senators, we're not electing a president right now, but we're electing the senators who have the duty to examine these candidates and vote for or against. We're affecting all these circuit courts of appeal. And then underneath that, there are what are called the district courts. These are federal courts as well, and there are even more of them, a lot more. Again, there are 13 circuits, but there are many more district courts on a more local level, but they're still federal courts, and therefore the president of the United States is still the one that chooses the men and women that fill those seats, and again, the United States Senate, some of whom you are going to be voting for in this midterm elections, are the ones responsible for confirming all of those people as well. So this is a lot of responsibility. Let's look a little bit at how we're doing, the good news is President Trump, despite the obstruction and tactics of delay of the Democrat Party, who do not want him to put his people into these courts, but who do not have absolute power to stop it either, do everything they can to obstruct and delay. We'll talk a little bit about how they do that. But despite that fact, President Trump has the best track record of any president in this far into his administration, almost 2 years into his first term, than any past president. So far, as we said, he has placed two new justices on the Supreme Court. On the courts of appeals, now these numbers are changing all the time because the Senate is really working hard on all of this. The latest numbers here that I have are that 29 judges that were nominated by President Trump have been confirmed to these circuit courts. That's very significant. It's a significant percentage of the circuit court judges. And what starts to happen is that these courts begin to have more and more Republican-nominated judges on them. And what that means, brothers and sisters, is that the way that they judge tends to proceed along the lines that favor our causes. Notice what I'm saying, because I'm speaking very carefully and precisely here. A judge is not supposed to be a politician. A judge's personal position on the issues is not supposed to matter. In fact, it does so much of the time. But even if a judge is completely impartial and says, I'm just going to apply the laws as written, the Constitution as originally written and intended, well, then those decisions are going to come down more on the side of life, more on the side of religious liberty, because these things are so ingrained in our American history and tradition, and there's nothing in the Constitution, for example, about abortion or about gay marriage. There's nothing in the Constitution about a lot of things that so-called activist judges have tried to write into the law. And so the point is that the more Republican-appointed judges there are in all these courts, and history bears this out when you start looking at the cases, the more of those cases are decided in ways that are favorable to the things we believe. On the other hand, the more Democrat-appointed judges, they tend to be the more liberal ones, and we get unfavorable decisions. So the president has been able to, and these numbers are always increasing, praise God, 29 judges. And then on the district courts, he's been able already to get about 53 judges. So he's got a great and tremendous track record here. Now, there are about 150 vacancies that still need to be filled, either current vacancies or vacancies retirements that have been announced. So we know the vacancies are coming right down the pike here. And there are already some 72 other judges that have been nominated, and they're awaiting action in the Senate. They are awaiting for these senators to do what they need to do in order to confirm them. Now, if you go, I want to show you the importance of elections in how these courts are affected. If you go to ProLife vote.com. Now that is our election headquarters here at Priests for Life. One of the key links that you will see says, it's a blue link, and it says elections change courts. Please take a note of this. And then take a moment to visit that page when you have time to look at it in more detail. I'll tell you a little bit about it right now. You will see there on this link that says Elections Change Courts, two maps of the United States with the states either red or blue. Now that doesn't represent where the voting of the state trends, but rather it represents, remember I told you about these different circuits divided geographically around the country so that a circuit court covers a certain number of states. So these maps show whether the circuit court that controls those states has a majority of Republican-appointed judges, again, then, who will vote in ways that favor our causes like pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-freedom, or are dominated by judges appointed by Democrat presidents. Now, what the maps show is what this distribution looked like at the end of the presidential term of George W. Bush, who was in the White House from 2001 to 2009, and then how it looked again at the end of the term of President Obama, who was in from 2009 to 2017. Here is the fact that the majority of these states in the map from 2009, after George W. Bush had his chance to fill all the vacancies that he was able to fill on the circuit courts and on the district courts, well, here the map is actually talking just about the circuit courts, it's mostly red. It's really just the Ninth Circuit way out in the West that was still under a majority of Democrat-controlled judges. At the end of Obama's time in the White House, it was flipped. It was flipped. Now, a couple of the circuits still had Republican-controlled majorities, but it was basically flipped. And so you see a lot more blue on that map. You also see this division in some bar graphs. Again, go to ProLifeVote.com, look for the blue link that says Elections Change Courts, and you can examine these maps on your own. You know, even if a court, by the way, President Trump has already been able to switch some of these back again to Republican-controlled majorities, but understand something else. I want to tell you something about how these courts work. Even if the Republican-appointed judges are not in the majority, more of them on those courts makes a difference because you will have, various numbers of judges on these courts. Okay, let's say you have 11 judges or whatever. When a case initially comes before a circuit court of appeal, it's heard not by all the judges on that court, it's heard by a 3-judge panel. And the 3-judge panel, like for example, when Priests for Life's case came before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, it was heard initially in that appellate court, in that circuit, by a 3-judge panel. Now, 2 of the 3 that heard our case were Obama appointees. Guess what? They ruled against us. Now, we eventually won up at the Supreme Court, but we had to appeal. But they ruled against us. But the 3-judge panel could have a Republican majority, even if the whole court does not. And these are computer-selected random selections of who these panels will be. So that can often happen, so that a case will end up being decided favorably, even if the court has a majority of Democratic appointees, because the 3-judge panels may in fact have a majority of Republican-appointed judges. So the bottom line is the president and the Senate are crucial to moving the courts in the right directions. The Democrats know that, and so the Democrat strategy, they are busy obstructing and delaying. They do not want President Trump's appointments confirmed. They know they have to deal with it. So what do they try to do? Well, one of the obstruction techniques that they try to use is to extend debate. There are a certain number of hours permitted by the rules of the Senate for how long you can debate one of these judicial nominations. Now, there are only so many hours in the day, there are only so many days in the year, and so they try to take the maximum amount of time, up to 30 hours of debate, for a single judicial confirmation. Now, I told you there's over 150 vacancies still to fill. You do the math. When are you going to be able to do all that work? The Republicans actually have been engaged in an effort to narrow and limit the amount of time that the Senate is able to debate on a particular judge, and that is very important. Sometimes there's other ways of speeding it up too. They can take a quicker route. And that's very much to the credit of the Republican Senate leadership, by the way. When you're in the majority, you control the calendar and the sequence of events. And Senator Mitch McConnell has been doing a great job here, and Senator Chuck Grassley, the head of the Judiciary Committee, whom you saw during the Kavanaugh hearings, doing a masterful job. But the Democrats always are trying to extend the debate, obstruct, and delay. Now, there's also another interesting thing called the blue slips. I don't know if you're familiar with the practice of the blue slips. It has nothing to do with Dems being designated as blue. It's literally the color of the form that is used. What this means is when a federal judge is nominated, the two United States senators from the state where that judge comes from can weigh in as to whether they approve or disapprove of that particular judge. Now, this is not determinative. What's determinative is that the Judiciary Committee votes on the nominee, sends that nominee to the full body of the Senate, and then the full body of 100 senators gets to vote. And according to the rules, the majority prevails. These judicial nominations, by the way, are no longer controlled by the filibuster. So the minority party cannot any longer filibuster a nominee to any of these federal courts, including the Supreme Court. Those rules were changed just really over the last 5 years. With a filibuster in place, it would be very much more difficult to confirm any of these judges because the majority party would not be enough to have a majority. They would have to get that 60-vote threshold, which is very hard to get. And with the Senate as closely divided as it is right now, you'd hardly get anything done. So that rule was changed, simple majority rules. However, the two senators from the home state of the judge are able to submit these blue slips. And for the district court, the circuit court, I erased that, the district courts, basically you need the two blue slips approval, otherwise those senators can effectively block that judge. But what happens with the circuit courts? Well, it's not absolute. Let's put it that way. And the Republican Senate has been much more willing to proceed with a judicial confirmation, even if a home senator in that state objects. Because you think about it, if it's a good, solid, conservative judge appointed by a Republican president and both senators from that state are liberal Democrats and they don't want president nominees confirmed, yeah, the blue slip can obviously be abused or be an unnecessary obstacle, ideological obstacle to being confirmed. So that the Republicans are not letting that happen. So brothers and sisters, let's move on here with a couple of other considerations. Another statistic here to keep in mind to show you how all the Democrat obstruction that goes on in the Senate. Cloture is the motion that the Senate leadership has to take to say to the senators, okay, we're going to stop debate now. We need to move on to the vote. Normally, it has to be invoked about on the average of 8 times a year. Under President Trump's administration so far, with the obstruction that the Democrats have tried to impose, it has had to be invoked 120 times. Just to show you how the Senate has had to push back. The Republican majority has had to push back against this Democrat obstruction. Another thing that the Republican leadership has done has been to limit vacation time and to say to them, senators, you want to go on your vacation? Well, we'll give you the vacation time. You take care of approving these judges. Otherwise, you stay here until the work gets done. And that, to the credit of the Senate leadership, again, has been one of the ways they've been dealing with this. But when you think of it overall, there have been some 400 measures taken by the House of Representatives that the Senate has not even taken up. And Besides judges, by the way, the people that President Trump appoints for his administration to fill various offices in the executive branch. I was just on a conference call with some folks from the White House and talking about this, and they said, we were talking about certain things that need to get done, and they said, we're having a hard time getting some of these things done because we still don't have the personnel in place to do them. The people we want in place in some of these offices haven't been confirmed yet by the Senate, because these executive appointments also have to be confirmed by the Senate. And if the Democrats keep dragging their feet, here we are halfway through the first term of the president, and some of these basic offices in the executive branch haven't even been filled yet. So the work is slowed down. It can't get done. At the rate, someone told me just the other day, at the rate at which the Democrats are going in being cooperative here, it would take 11 years to confirm all the positions that still have to be filled. This has got to stop. You have to understand, brothers and sisters, that when these Democrat senators want to get into power, they want to take over the Senate altogether. I don't think they'll get the majority in this election, but that's what they want. And those that are asking you for their vote, if your state has a U.S. Senate vote and your candidate is Democrat, my goodness. Talk to them about the obstruction. Raise the awareness of these things that I'm saying so that people will understand. Well, brothers and sisters, let's talk a little bit about the role of the courts, because this is where we get into, again, make the courts great again. What's the motivation for electing Republican senators under a Republican president? We know that if the president and the Senate are both Republican, we're going to get the right kind of judges. Judges who, like Neil Gorsuch, like Brett Kavanaugh, understand that the Constitution has a meaning that has to be respected and applied. The laws have a meaning as written. They have to be applied that way. The judge is not in that court to impose his or her own personal preferences or to rewrite the Constitution or to rewrite the laws. And yet, that's what's happening. And the Democrats cheer that on. The liberals cheer that on because you know what? That's the only way that they can get their agenda advanced. Does the name Michael Newdow ring any bells? He's the guy out in the West Coast who tried to get under God taken out of the Pledge of Allegiance. So this atheist had this idea. He didn't go to his local congressman and suggest that a bill be introduced into the Congress to take under God out of the Pledge of Allegiance, because he knew full well that the elected representatives of the people would never go for that. What did he do instead? He went to the courts, because that's how the liberals advance their liberal agenda. When they don't have the support of the people, which they don't for most of their wacko ideas, they go to the courts and find an equally wacko judge appointed by a wacko Democrat, and they get their agenda shoved down the throats of the American people as a result. Do you know that when we study in school the reasons for the American Revolution, what's the one that we hear about the most? Well, the one we hear about the most is taxation without representation. Well, actually, the founders gave 27 reasons why they were rebelling against Great Britain, why they were dissatisfied and came to the decision that they had to be independent. And only one of those reasons, in fact, I think it was 17th down the list, was taxation without representation. 4 of the reasons, on the other hand, guess what they had to do with? The behavior of judges. Judicial activism, out of control courts that were imposing policy rather than being neutral arbiters. This was a key reason for the revolution in the first place. Judicial activism, or as some have called it, judicial tyranny. Out of control courts. I'm going to give you some examples of this. You know a lot of this full well. On the other hand, some of these cases you may not have heard about. But first of all, let me quote for you a little bit of what our founding fathers said about the courts. First of all, by the way, I'm relying on books by 2 colleagues and friends, one of whom now is deceased, Phyllis Schlafly, founder of Eagle Forum. This was the woman who who was most responsible for holding back the ERA and also for the Equal Rights Amendment battle back in the 70s, and also for keeping the pro-life plank of the Republican Party in place and strong. She wrote this book, The Supremacists, The Tyranny of Judges and How to Stop It, Phyllis Schlafly. And in fact, we pray for her repose. We miss her very much. And this is a nice signed copy that Phyllis gave me, this book herself. And she talks about what the founders said about the courts. She quotes right at the beginning Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, 78, who said that the judiciary, this third branch of government, you have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and then you have the judicial branch. And he said it will, quote, always be the least dangerous branch of government. It's supposed to be the weakest in the sense that all it has, it doesn't command an army, it doesn't write laws. All it has is the power of judgment. It's supposed to be the least dangerous branch of government, dangerous in the sense that it could lead the country astray. And it was that way for the first century and a half of our republic. But in the last 50 years or so or more, it's gotten pretty out of control. We're going to give you some examples of that. The other book I'm relying on here, by the way, is by my friend and colleague David Barton of Wall Builders. Check him out. He's really great. This little short book is called Restraining Judicial Activism. So between David Barton, Restraining Judicial Activism, and Phyllis Schlafly, The Supremacists, you read these two books, you'll be pretty well informed about judicial activism. But let me read what Thomas Jefferson wrote. He said, "The germ of dissolution of our federal government is in the constitution of the federal judiciary, working like gravity by night and by day, gaining a little today and a little tomorrow, and advancing its noiseless step like a thief over the field of jurisdiction until all shall be usurped." He's pointing out a danger of the courts. He likewise wrote this, and this is crucially important. Each of the three departments, that is, the courts, the judicial branch, the presidency, the executive branch, the Congress, the legislative branch, each of these three has equally the right to decide for itself what is its duty under the Constitution, without any regard to what the others may have decided for themselves under a similar question. Now, this is something that people don't understand. They will usually think that the Congress writes the laws, that's true. The president is there to enforce the laws, that's true. And that the courts are there to interpret the laws, well, that's true too. But people oversimplify this and they say, well, the court's role is to interpret the Constitution. Well, here's the point that Jefferson is making in the quote that I just read. The president also is charged with interpreting and defending the Constitution, and the lawmakers, your legislators in Congress, likewise are charged with interpreting, applying, defending the Constitution. Jefferson makes it clear. The Constitution is over them all, and they are all bound to it. As a matter of fact, they all take an oath. Now, some of you may have seen, I was there at the White House with Alveda King just a few weeks ago for the swearing-in ceremony of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And when we were there with the President, with Justice Kavanaugh, with all the Supreme Court justices, with retired Justice Anthony Kennedy, and so forth, we were witnessing him take what is called the Judicial Oath, and that talks about faithfully fulfilling his role as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. But there's a second oath that the justices have to take, and that's called the Constitutional Oath. And when you look at the wording of the Constitutional Oath that a judge has to take, and then you compare it with the wording of the Constitutional Oath that the President takes when he is inaugurated, and you compare the wording of that with the oath that is taken every opening of every Congress in January by the members of Congress, they have to take an oath too. The wording is practically identical. That they will preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And they have to preserve and protect and defend that Constitution according to their understanding of it. They're not bound to defend the Constitution the way the court says it should be defended. They are bound to do so with their own understanding of that same Constitution. And yet we have one Constitution, and yet people talk about different kinds of judges, liberal judges, conservative judges, moderate judges. Justice Scalia famously said, let me quote him, he said, "What in the world is a moderate interpretation of a constitutional text? Halfway between what it says and what we'd like it to say?" And that was Justice Scalia's way of thinking and talking. Let me read for you a few examples of the problem here when we start talking about liberal activist judges, the kind that the Democrats want, the kind that atheists like Michael Newdow go to because they know they won't make progress with the elected representatives of the people who have a lot more sense than some of these judges. Phyllis summarizes for us in her book. Here's what judicial supremacists and activists have done. Censored the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools, removed the Ten Commandments from public buildings and parks, changed the definition of marriage, banned the acknowledgement of God in public schools, imposed taxes, rewritten laws of criminal procedures, dismantled laws that protect internal security, imposed the social experimentation called forced school busing, upheld racial preferences and quotas in hiring and college admissions, outlawed term limits for members of Congress, rewritten laws on the conduct of elections. They have invented so-called rights such as the right to abortion, the right to same-sex marriage licenses, the right to show and publish pornography, even with taxpayers' money, the right of illegal aliens to receive taxpayer-paid benefits. These supremacists have overturned laws adopted by majorities in statewide referenda. Hear what we're saying here. Majorities of the people living in a state have a vote in the state and they decide something, and these activist judges have overturned such decisions in California, in Colorado, in Arizona, in Arkansas, and in Washington state. Judicial supremacists have set themselves up as a super executive and grabbed authority to micromanage schools and prisons and hiring standards and legislative apportionment. This situation is out of control. Back in 1962, this is one of the early signs and casualties of judicial activism. The Supreme Court issued a decision called Engel versus Vitale. Some of you know what this said. That's the one that overturned the long-standing tradition of prayer in our schools. There was a voluntary, not obligatory, voluntary, non-denominational prayer in a public school and was declared unconstitutional. Problem was the court did not have a single precedent on which it relied, because never in the 170 years from the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights until that time, never had any court struck down any prayer in any form in any place. So, like, the history of this was zero. I mean, this was literally out of the blue that the Supreme Court said this simple, short, non-denominational, voluntary prayer in a public school all of a sudden was unconstitutional. So for 170 years, we missed that in the Constitution? Or was it just that these judges decided to all of a sudden put it in there? This is judicial activism. This is judicial tyranny. This is creating policy, not applying the Constitution. The most destructive example of this, of course, the 1973 Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton decisions legalizing child killing by abortion. Abortion and any kind of right to abortion is nowhere in the Constitution or in the history and traditions of our country. Nowhere. And they made it up out of thin air. And in fact, one of the dissenting justices in that case, there were two dissenters, it was a 7-2 decision, Byron White, said that the court delivered, quote, an exercise of raw judicial power, an improvident and extravagant exercise of the power of judicial review. You know, a lot of times we say that the judges in our federal system have lifetime appointments. Well, it's only partially true. They serve for life on the condition, it's conditional. The Constitution doesn't automatically give them lifetime appointments. You know what it actually says? That they may serve on the courts for the duration, not of their lives, but for the duration of good behavior. And do you know what has been considered bad behavior by judges? The kind of activist decisions that we're giving examples of here. So, in other words, and of course, if they're guilty of bad behavior, they can be subject to impeachment. The idea when we look at the history of impeachment, when we look at the history of the courts, the idea here is that the bad behavior of a judge is right here, the activism. That he or she transgresses the boundaries of their constitutional authority and start rewriting laws and rewriting the Constitution while in the meantime the Constitution says all lawmaking authority is invested only in the Congress, not in the court, in the Congress. Let me give a few more examples of decisions that have been wildly activist. There's a quick case called Missouri versus Jenkins. In this case, the Supreme Court made it possible for a single judge to impose a tax increase on an entire state. Single judge. In order to pay for social programs that judge ordered, even though and after the people had voted against the tax increase. This is a blatant example of what we mean by judicial activism. Another case, United States versus Eichmann, 1990 case. Against legislation at the state and federal level, the court ruled that the American flag could not in any circumstance be protected from desecration, contrary to state and federal legislation. Another decision, League of United Latin American Citizens versus Wilson. A single Jimmy Carter appointed federal judge nullified the state of California's Proposition 187, which prohibited taxpayer benefits to illegal aliens. That provision passed in 1994 with 5 million votes. Now later, let's see, no, this is another case. A California civil rights initiative that was overwhelmingly passed in 1996 to end state racial preferences was nullified by a single federal judge. Again, a whole state votes on something and passes it, and a judge comes along and gets rid of it. The lawmaking belongs to the lawmaking body, and the people are represented by them. The people can vote on certain things. The courts are not supposed to be changing that. Now, fortunately, in that case, a higher court overruled that federal judge and said this. She says sometimes the courts themselves will recognize and correct a certain amount of this judicial activism. That was what happened here. And the court that overruled this said the following: a system which permits one judge to block with the stroke of a pen what 4,736,180 state residents would enact as law tests the integrity of our constitutional democracy. Well, you can say that again. It tests its integrity. It contradicts its integrity. So are you motivated in this election by the courts? Are you motivated in this election to see judges who are going to exercise the good behavior, which means, first of all, being humble enough